My name is Megan Carter. I am 30 years old. 4 years ago, my sister-in-law, Brooke Lawson, spread rumors that I married her brother Jacob only for financial security and not real love, and she excluded me from several family events to prove her point. Now, here in the Denver hospital, after my husband Jacob's accident, I hear her telling the doctors and my mother-in-law Nancy that I should not be making any decisions for him because I have never been truly part of the family. My hands shake, but I resolve right then that I will finally stand up and stop her from isolating me completely. If you have ever felt like the odd one out in your own in-law family, let me know in the comments. Sharing your stories helps me feel less alone in this mess. I still remember the exact afternoon 11 years ago when I first met my husband at a community fundraiser in downtown Denver. I was working as a project coordinator at a small architecture firm, juggling deadlines and learning how to stand up for my ideas in meetings. My husband was there with his parents, and we struck up a conversation about sustainable building practices that turned into coffee the next week and eventually a relationship that felt solid and real. My own parents liked him right away, but from the beginning, my sister-in-law, Brooke Lawson, made it clear she had other opinions. She was my husband's older sister, married at the time, and living just outside the city, and she had a way of inserting herself into every plan we made. At first, the comments were small, the kind of thing I tried to brush off as sisterly protectiveness. She would casually mention at Sunday brunches how my husband had always dated women with stronger family connections or better career paths, and she would laugh as if it were a joke, while her eyes stayed cold. I told myself it was nothing. My husband defended me every time, and my father-in-law would pull me aside later to offer quiet encouragement. My father-in-law reminded me a lot of the steady mentors I had at work. He had built his own contracting business from the ground up, and he treated me like I belonged, teaching me little things about contracts and negotiation that helped me advance from project coordinator to senior coordinator within 4 years. My best friend, Isabella Ruiz, who I'd known since college, would listen to my stories over long walks in the park and remind me that not every in-law had to like me as long as my husband did. Even my mentor, Kevin Morales, at the firm, noticed when I seemed distracted at work and gave me practical advice on setting professional boundaries that I started applying at home too. The first real violation happened about 2 years into our marriage. We had planned a weekend trip to the mountains for my husband's birthday, just the two of us, but my sister-in-law called the night before and insisted we change it to a group event at her house because family should celebrate together. My husband tried to push back, but she kept repeating how disappointed my mother-in-law would be. I ended up spending the entire weekend fetching drinks and listening to my sister-in-law tell stories about my husband's ex-girlfriends while I sat on the edge of the couch. When I brought it up later with my husband, he apologized and promised it would not happen again, but the pattern had already started. My sister-in-law began forwarding me group texts for family dinners that somehow never included me in the replies, or she would post photos on social media of the family, together with captions that made it look like I had never existed. Each time I confronted her, she would tilt her head and say something like, "Megan, you are so sensitive. We are just a close family. You will get used to it." My father-in-law saw what was happening and started inviting me to lunch alone to talk about work projects or life in general. He would say things like, "You have a good head on your shoulders. Do not let anyone dim that light." Those conversations kept me steady. At the same time, my job was going well. I landed a big contract for a community center redesign, and my mentor, Kevin Morales, took me out for a celebratory coffee to review the proposal details. My best friend, Isabella Ruiz, cheered me on during late-night calls, reminding me that my worth did not depend on my sister-in-law's approval. Yet the small violations kept piling up. My sister-in-law would forget to include my name on holiday cards, or she would suggest to my mother-in-law that I should sit at the children's table during gatherings because I was still the newest member. My husband would sigh and tell me he would speak to her, but the damage was already done. I started feeling like an outsider in my own marriage, always waiting for the next subtle jab. That tension followed us right into the hospital 4 days ago. My husband had been in a minor car accident on the highway, nothing life threatening, but enough to require stitches and observation. I rushed there from work, still in my business casual clothes, heart pounding the whole drive. When I arrived, my sister in law was already in the waiting area with my mother in law and my father in law. The moment I walked through the doors, my sister in law stood up and stepped directly in front of me. "Megan," she said in that sweet but sharp voice she always used when others were listening, "the doctor is about to update us. Maybe you should wait out here. This is a family matter, and you have never really been part of the inner circle." My mother in law looked uncomfortable, but did not correct her. My father in law opened his mouth to speak, but my sister in law cut him off with a quick hand on his arm. I felt the familiar burn in my chest, the same one I had pushed down for years. "My sister in law, my husband, is my husband," I said quietly but firmly. "I am not waiting anywhere." She smiled that thin smile and turned back to the doctor who had just stepped out. "Doctor, we can handle the decisions from here. Megan is a little overwhelmed, and she has never dealt with anything like this in our family before." The words landed like a slap, but I kept my face neutral. Inside, I was shaking. My husband was awake by then, groggy from the pain medication, and when he saw me, he reached for my hand. "Stay," he whispered. That one word gave me the strength to sit down next to his bed while my sister-in-law hovered nearby, her eyes never leaving me. The doctor explained the next steps for monitoring and possible overnight stay. My sister-in-law immediately jumped in again. "We will take care of the paperwork. Megan can go home and rest. She has work tomorrow, and we do not want her to burn out." Her tone was all concern on the surface, but the sarcasm underneath was unmistakable. My mother-in-law nodded slowly, and I could see my father-in-law clenching his jaw. I squeezed my husband's hand tighter. "I am staying right here," I told the room. My sister-in-law let out a soft laugh. "Of course you are. Always so dramatic." The doctor excused himself, and the room went quiet except for the beeping machines. I thought that was the end of it for the moment. But as the nurse stepped out to fetch more supplies, my sister-in-law leaned close to my mother-in-law and whispered something I could just barely hear. She has been waiting for something like this to happen, so she can play the devoted wife card. We both know she is not built for this family long term. My mother-in-law's eyes flicked toward me and my stomach dropped. I pretended I had not heard, but the words echoed in my head. My husband was drifting back to sleep exhausted, and I sat there wondering how many more small violations it would take before I finally drew a real line. My sister-in-law caught my eye across the room and gave me that same thin smile again, as if she knew exactly what I was thinking. The air in the room felt heavier than the sterile hospital smell, and I realized this visit was not just about my husband's accident anymore. It was the moment everything I had ignored for years was about to boil over. Later that evening, once my husband had been moved to a private room for observation, the family gathered again. My sister-in-law took charge of the conversation, outlining a recovery schedule that conveniently left me out of most decisions. My father-in-law interrupted her, once his voice carrying a rare edge of frustration. "Brooke, Megan has every right to be involved. She is my son's wife." My sister-in-law brushed it off with a wave and changed the subject to old family vacation stories that never once mentioned me. I stayed silent, holding my husband's hand, but inside the resolve from earlier grew stronger. By the time discharge papers arrived the next morning, I had already decided to document every cutting remark in a private note on my phone, just in case the isolation continued at home. 2 days later, we were back in our small house on the edge of Denver, the kind of place we had picked, because it felt like ours, not part of the bigger family compound my sister-in-law kept pushing us toward. My husband was resting on the couch, still sore, but improving when my sister-in-law showed up unannounced with a casserole and that same thin smile. "Thought you could use some real food, not whatever quick thing Megan throws together after work." She set the dish down and immediately started rearranging the pillows around my husband like I was not even in the room. I bit my tongue and offered her coffee instead. She took it, then leaned in closer to him. If this had happened to me, the whole family would have moved in to help. But I guess some people prefer to keep things separate. The jab hit exactly where it always did, reminding me I was never quite family enough. I excused myself to the kitchen to call my best friend Isabella Ruiz. She picked up on the first ring, her voice warm and steady, like always. "Megan, tell me what is happening." "You sound wrecked." I whispered the whole hospital scene and the casserole visit, and she let out a long breath. "That woman has been gunning for you since day one. You remember when she tried to get you uninvited from their anniversary party 3 years ago? This is the same game. Do not let her isolate you again." Her words helped, but the knot in my chest stayed tight. When I hung up, my mentor Kevin Morales texted from the firm asking how my husband was doing and if I needed to shift any deadlines. I replied that I had it under control, even though I was already mentally calculating how many late nights I would need to catch up. That evening, my sister-in-law did not leave. Instead, she settled in like she owned the place, chatting with my husband about old family stories that never included me. At one point, she glanced my way and said, "Megan, you look exhausted. Why do not you head to bed early? We have got this covered." The sarcasm dripped from every word, like she was doing me a favor by taking over my own home. My husband looked torn, his eyes pleading with me to stay, but the exhaustion from the past 48 hours was winning. I went upstairs for a moment to breathe, and that was when I heard her voice float up from the living room, lower now, talking to my mother-in-law on the phone. "Nancy, we need to have a real family discussion about long-term plans. Megan has never been built for this kind of commitment. Remember how she almost backed out of the wedding when things got real?" My heart slammed against my ribs. I had never backed out of anything. The wedding had been perfect, but my sister-in-law had spent the whole reception whispering to cousins that I was only in it for the stability. I crept back downstairs just as she hung up. My husband was dozing again, and my sister-in-law turned to me with that cold sweetness. "We are thinking of calling a family meeting tomorrow. Just the Carters. You understand, right? Some things are better handled internally." The words landed like another slap, but this time, something shifted inside me. I opened my mouth to push back when my husband woke and asked what was going on. Before I could answer, my sister-in-law jumped in again. "Nothing you need to worry about, little brother. Megan and I are just figuring out the best way forward for you." My father-in-law showed up the next morning, unannounced, his face still carrying that quiet anger from the hospital. He pulled my sister-in-law aside in the kitchen while I pretended to load the dishwasher. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough. "You keep undermining her, and you are going to lose more than you think." My sister-in-law's reply was sharp and low. "She has never earned her place here. Why pretend otherwise?" Their voices rose for a second, then dropped again. When they came back out, my father-in-law gave me a small nod, like a silent promise he had my back. But the damage was already spreading. My husband noticed the tension and asked me later that afternoon if everything was okay between me and his sister. I wanted to tell him the full truth, but the words stuck. Instead, I said we were working on it, even as my phone buzzed with a text from my sister-in-law. The message was short and vicious. "Family meeting is set for tomorrow night at Mom and Dad's. Jacob needs rest, so do not drag him into your drama. Some of us actually know how to put family first." I stared at the screen, the words blurring for a second. This was not just about the accident anymore. It was about every subtle exclusion, every rumor, every time she had made me feel like an outsider in my own marriage. My best friend Isabella Ruiz called again that night, sensing something was worse. "Megan, if she is escalating like this, you need to set a boundary before it gets uglier." I agreed, but the fear of what that boundary might cost kept me awake long after my husband had fallen asleep. The next morning, my mother-in-law stopped by with more food and a hesitant smile, but I could tell she had already picked a side in her mind. She mentioned the family meeting casually, like it was no big deal, and I felt the walls closing in. By late afternoon, the pressure had built to a breaking point. I sat on the edge of the bed while my husband rested, replaying every cutting remark my sister in law had thrown at me over the years. My mentor, Kevin Morales, texted again from work offering to cover my biggest client meeting if I needed more time, and that small kindness almost broke me. I realized I could not keep pretending this was normal. When my sister in law arrived early for the supposed family meeting, she did not even knock. She walked straight into the living room and announced, "We are doing this here instead. Easier on Jacob." Then she looked at me and delivered the sharpest jab yet. "Megan, you have played the supportive wife long enough. Time to step back and let the real family take over before you burn everything down." The room went still. My husband's eyes widened, and my father-in-law, who had come with her, actually stood up and said, "Brooke, that is crossing a line." But my sister-in-law just shrugged and kept her eyes on me, waiting for me to crack. I felt the old pattern pulling at me, the one where I smoothed things over to keep the peace. This time, something inside refused. I stood up slowly, my voice steadier than I expected. "No, this ends tonight." The words hung there heavy and final, but before anyone could respond, my sister-in-law pulled out her phone and read a message out loud with a smirk. "Mom just texted. She agrees. We need to talk about what is best for Jacob long term, and it might not include certain people who have never really belonged." My breath caught. The meeting was not about support. It was about deciding my place once and for all. My husband reached for my hand, but the look on his face told me even he was starting to see the cracks. I knew in that moment I was one conversation away from drawing a line I could never uncross, and the thought terrified me as much as it freed me. My sister-in-law watched me, waiting, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of someone who had finally pushed too far. The living room felt smaller than ever, with all of us crowded around my husband on the couch, the casserole dish still steaming on the coffee table, like some kind of peace offering that nobody believed. My sister-in-law crossed her arms and tilted her head, that thin smile never reaching her eyes. "Megan, let us be honest here. You have played the role long enough, but this accident showed us what we already knew. You are not built for the heavy lifting in this family. Some people just do not fit, no matter how hard they try to force it." Her words sliced straight through me, laced with that cold sarcasm she had perfected over 11 years. I felt my cheeks burn, but I kept my voice level. "I have been part of this family for over a decade, my sister-in-law. I married my husband because I love him, not because I was looking for some backup plan." My mother-in-law shifted in her seat, eyes on the floor, saying nothing as usual. My husband reached for my hand, his grip weak from the pain medication, but my sister-in-law cut in before he could speak. "Love, please. You have always had one foot out the door with your career and your little meetings with that mentor of yours. While the rest of us show up for each other, you show up when it is convenient." My father-in-law suddenly stood his face, flushing with a defensive outburst I had never seen from him before. "Enough, my sister-in-law. You are not the gatekeeper of this family, and I will not sit here while you tear Megan down in her own home." He turned to me, voice softer, but still firm. "Megan, you have my full support. You always have." Then just as quickly, he excused himself to the kitchen, muttering something about needing water, leaving an awkward silence that my sister-in-law filled immediately. "See, even Dad is getting tired of the drama you bring. Maybe it is time you step back and let the real family handle things." My husband tried to mediate, his voice tired. "Everyone, please. I just want to get better without all this." But the tension hung thick, and I could feel the years of small exclusions piling up into something I could no longer ignore. I looked at my sister-in-law and said the words that had been building for 4 years. "I think it is time I set some boundaries. I am not stepping back from my husband, but I am done letting you make me feel like an outsider every single day." The room went still again. My sister-in-law laughed short and sharp. "Boundaries. How convenient. You finally admit you were never really one of us. Later that night, after my sister-in-law had left with a dramatic sigh and my mother-in-law trailing behind her, I sat on the edge of the bed while my husband rested. He looked at me with those sad eyes and whispered, "I hate that she does this to you. But she is my sister. Can we just try to keep the peace?" His words stung because I knew he meant well, yet they also showed me how deep the divide had grown. I told him I needed some space to think not from him, but from the constant pressure. The next morning, I called my best friend, Isabella Ruiz, while I drove to grab coffee for us both. She listened without interrupting, then said, "Megan, you have carried this for too long. Setting boundaries does not make you the villain, but it might mean some lonely days ahead. You ready for that?" Her warning settled in my chest like a stone. I thanked her and hung up, then met my mentor, Kevin Morales, at a quiet cafe near the office. He had rearranged his schedule when I texted him about needing to talk, and over 2 cups of coffee, he gave me practical advice on how to protect my work while I figured out the personal side. "You are one of the best coordinators we have. Do not let family noise derail the career you built. Take the time you need, but come back stronger." His support felt like a lifeline, yet it also reminded me how much of my life had been spent proving I belonged somewhere. 2 weeks later, the boundaries I set started to show their cost. I told my sister-in-law over a short phone call that I would not be joining the upcoming family barbecue or any group events for the foreseeable future. "I need room to breathe without the constant jabs," I said. She responded with venom. "Fine, Megan. Run away like you always do when things get real. My brother deserves better than someone who bails at the first sign of family responsibility." I hung up before she could add more, my hands shaking. My husband understood but looked heartbroken every time his phone lit up with messages from his side of the family, asking where I was. My father-in-law texted me privately a few days after that, saying he respected my choice and would check in when he could, but he also admitted the family rift was widening and he was stepping back to avoid making it worse. The weeks stretched into a quiet kind of loneliness I had not expected. I focused on work landing another community project with my mentor Kevin Morales' help and spent evenings with my best friend Isabella Ruiz when she could drive up from her side of the city. She brought takeout and listened while I processed everything, but even her friendship could not fill the empty space where the extended family used to be. My husband and I grew closer, in some ways navigating his recovery together, yet the distance I had created from my sister-in-law and my mother-in-law created a subtle strain between us too. He never asked me to change my mind, but I could see the toll it took on him during quiet dinners when the phone stayed silent. One evening, 3 months after the hospital, I stood on our back porch looking out at the Denver lights, the journal I'd started keeping on my lap. I wrote about the day my sister-in-law had first made me feel invisible and how far we had come to this point of necessary separation. There was no big dramatic showdown or satisfying payback, just the heavy realization that choosing myself meant standing in a quieter room than I had imagined. My parents called occasionally, offering gentle support, but they lived far enough away that their words felt distant too. The isolation settled in like a permanent guest, uncomfortable but honest. I learned that self-preservation sometimes looks like empty chairs at holiday tables and unanswered group texts. It looks like explaining to my husband why I cannot pretend everything is fine anymore. And it looks like waking up each day knowing I finally stopped letting my sister-in-law define my place in the world, even if that world feels smaller now. The lesson was not about winning or exposing anyone. It was about accepting that sometimes the price of peace is carrying the quiet weight of what you had to leave behind. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to set boundaries with family and ended up feeling more alone than you expected, drop a comment below. Your experiences mean more to me than you know.